join us for our second installment of the Coffee Chat series here at HFR. If you have your warm beverage, you can show that off or tell us in the chat what you're drinking. We figured in February in Arizona, where most of our staff is, that it would be a little colder and would be the right temperature for a hot beverage. Unfortunately, it's like 85 degrees here, but hopefully it's colder where you are. Yeah, we love these events so much and are so glad to continue the series. It offers such a different side of the writing world, and often that's a more intimate side as well. We also just love to pick our contributors' brains about their writing lives. Hopefully we get some good tips and tricks, some insights ourselves. So it should be a lot of fun. We'll have some links in the chat for you throughout the night, links to purchase our most recent issue of HFR, issue 68. Very pretty. So we'll have that in the chat for you. We'll have links to read or purchase more of our writers' works and probably some other things along the way. And yeah, we're gonna jump into it. I have our web editor here with me as well that's going to help us moderate the event, Christina D'Antoni. We're going to start by introducing our writers and then we'll get into the conversation. If we have time for an audience Q&A, then we're going to also do some of that. So if you have questions throughout the event, please use the Zoom Q&A function and you can throw your questions in there for us. And then if we have time at the end, we will be able to go through those. I think that is all from me. I'm going to hand it over to Christina.
Hey everyone, I have a mug. It is empty, which is good for Zoom, not knocking it over, right? So I'm Christina and I'm the web editor at HFR, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dani Oliver tonight. Dani Oliver's poetry and fiction has been published in Hayden's Ferry Review, Barrel House, Washington Square Review, Poet Lore, The Rumpus, Portland Review, Shooter Literary Magazine, and others. She was named a Virginia Middleton Creative Writing Award winner and awarded the Candace Silverman Memorial Scholarship by David St. John and Carol Muskie Dukes. And she holds an MFA in creative writing from Rutgers University, Camden, where she was awarded an interdisciplinary fellowship. She currently lives in Brooklyn, where she works at N+1. So join me in welcoming Dani Oliver to our coffee chat.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Christina. I'm going to introduce K-Ming very quickly, and then we will jump into our first question. K-Ming Chang is a Kundiman Fellow, a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. She's the author of the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice novel Bestiary. In 2021, her chapbook Bone House was published by Bull City Press. Her short story collection, Gods of Want, is forthcoming from One World, as well as a novel titled Organ Meats. Awesome, thank you. Let's welcome K-Ming as well. We have two wonderful writers here. I'm so excited to learn from you all. And I'm going to just give you our first question. And then the rest of them, me and Christina will be putting into the chat for you. But to start us off, I'd love to hear about you talking about beginnings, how the two of you begin, kind of along the lines of how an idea turns into something concrete like a story or a poem or a written work. I'm especially interested in what that looked like for the specific pieces that you had in HFR, and maybe you can kind of walk us through what your process looks like in the beginning.
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start? Also, hi, K-Ming. You want me to start?
Hi, yeah, you can start. You can definitely start.
Okay, cool. First of all, thank you so much to Hayden's Ferry Review for having us here. This is lovely, and I feel very touched that I was asked. So thanks, guys, and thanks for the nice introductions. Hi to everybody out there. I can see you in the chat. So we wanted to hear about beginnings, I guess, specifically with that poem. This is a really good question. It's a really hard question. I think the only pattern that I've sort of come to understand about like how I begin a poem is that it's always for me something I become very fixated on. I don't know if that's the same for you, but it can literally be like I'll be in the shower and I'll like hear the same line over and over, and I'm like, what is that? Like, do I know that? Is that something I'm writing? I don't know what the deal is. I could become like obsessed with the syntax of something. Yes, to shower thoughts, I love that. But like I can be obsessed with the syntax of like a line. What happens more recently is that I become sort of like obsessed with the concept that I don't understand, whether it's about myself or the universe or whatever the hell is going on around me. It's just something that I don't get. Things that have been on my mind a lot, something that I like can't, explain my way out of. I'll also say that like 99% of the time for me, my writing, the beginnings come from reading. If I'm not reading, I'm not writing. That's just how it is. And so I feel like a lot of my poems come from having read another poem, somebody else's poem, and then something comes out of it, whether it's related or not. Specifically for the poem that's in the issue. Well, actually, I want to ask you first, and then maybe we can talk about like our specific poems. But is there like a pattern for like what you've realized makes you, what the catalyst for your writing?
Yeah, I really love what you said about something that you don't understand about yourself or understand, because I really like that idea of beginning with curiosity. And I think that's often where I begin to, oftentimes similar to you, there will be like a phrase or language or a sentence that oftentimes like pops up in my mind, or something I'm turning over my head and I'm very curious. So oftentimes it's the first sentence spoken by a narrator. And I will just be curious, maybe confused about, oh, who would say this and under what circumstances? And I think that curiosity unravels for me on the page, and I like to follow the thread of that. And then I also have kind of two extremes of beginnings. I either like to begin with a complete blank page and kind of with a sense of nothing and just allow my obsessions to arrive on the page, or I like to accumulate a ton of language and just have this document that's full of words, full of phrases, full of thoughts and fragments, full of ideas and titles. So I like one of those two, but I find that both of those things, one of those things can really help me, either feeling really liberated of like not needing to write toward anything, or towards having just like this overflow of words, phrases, or images that I just need to kind of find a place for, or find an organization or structure for. And then also something that you said made me think that I'm actually kind of the opposite in a way, which I love, is if you're not reading, you're not writing. And I think for me, when I'm writing, I actually have trouble reading. I'll want to read, but I'll be unable to. And I'll find that when I'm in like the midst or the depths of drafting something, I actually can't read. And sometimes there will be even like a month or 2 months of where I'm really intensely drafting something, and I'll have books out, but I'll only be able to read like a paragraph at a time, like almost treating it like prose poetry, where I'm just like dipping into moments in a different work or dipping into a book, but I can't like sit down and immerse myself. I think because I don't know, I need to feel really isolated in the process, and a little bit like I'm not comparing myself to anything, and otherwise I'll be like, oh my god, everything I'm drafting is terrible and awful and it'll never be this like beautiful thing that I love so much. And so I'll often have my favorite books out, and I'll look at words, I'll look at phrases and moments, but I won't be able to read something from like beginning to end, or I won't be able to start anything new. Yeah,
that's I love that. No, that's fascinating. I never would have thought about it like that. I do think maybe there is like Yeah, there's definitely like a quality thing going on when like I'll read like a really good poem when I'm trying to write and I'm like, why even bother? Like who, like what am I doing? But no, that's really interesting that like, do you feel like it's like that you're absorbed in like the world that you're writing? Is that part of it too? Like it's just like I live here right now, I can't live somewhere else.
Yeah, I think part of it is that it prevents me from like stepping back from the writing and like conceptualizing it as a piece of writing. Because I think oftentimes if I start reading something and then I'm like, oh, these are all the reasons why I love it, I'll go back to my work and kind of like analyze it a little bit distant from it of like, oh, what are the themes that I'm exploring? What is the structure I want to have for it? Like, what is the form I want it to take? And I find that when I'm drafting, it's helpful just to not have any of those ideas or concepts in my mind, to just like follow the language and not think of it as like a book or a story or a work with a specific structure or form. And it's just helpful for me in finishing. And then I think when I'm editing, I'm like, read everything, and then like imitate all of these different forms and like start to think about it more from a more external, like taking a step back from the piece. But then in the drafting, I have to just like, I don't know, have this like tunnel vision happening, I think.
I love that. It's like, yeah, it's like a protective mode in a way. It's like you're honoring your work by like, I don't know, staying with it and like not thinking about the industry or thinking about like what your book is going to be on a shelf. Like, I think that's really beautiful. That's really cool. The second part of the question was about the specific beginnings of our pieces, I believe. And so the piece that I have in the issue is called This Mania. I feel like if I have something that I'm fixated on that I like I'm not ready to approach yet, it ends up in a notebook or in a mental catalog or whatever. I've read notebook I've used since I was like 18, where it's just like miscellaneous garbage, like this will live here. And I like, This Mania is about like manic episodes or manic periods of my life. And I never knew exactly how to approach that. I didn't know what to do. I was in a very contrived situation in grad school where I like had to write X pages for my thesis and I didn't have enough. And I was like, well, I'll go to the notebook and I'll like find something to write about. And I was like, ooh, this is a hard one. Let me try this one. And kind of like you and what you said about like giving yourself material and then organizing it, I had a first line that I really wanted to work with. I had been reading a lot of work at the time that was like, poems all started in a very declarative way. And I have a tendency, and maybe it's not a good tendency, to sort of like tiptoe into a poem, like bring the reader in like just a little at a time. And I was reading all this poetry that was like, first sentence, wow, like, okay, that's you've made a statement, like whatever. And so I had this sentence in my head, no animals compete with this mania, is the first line. And in that, I gave myself animals. So I gave myself sort of this like large, like pool of vocabulary of like verbs that you can use for animals and things like that. And I don't know, I sort of followed the declarative. So no animals compete with this mania. There's the sentence, I gave myself competition, and like adding a narrator that's talking about like competitiveness against animals is like so fruitful and like actually producing tension. And I think the other thing that I did with that poem that I was like, where it like led me and what the beginnings were, is I was also writing a crap ton of very dense poetry. And I was like, why am I doing this? This isn't going to work for this poem. And so I played with tercets. So the beginning being, I have a line that I want to explore the same way you talked about, like having a line of dialogue from somebody and like, what situation is this? I had a form that I wanted to experiment with. I had some constrictions that like I had never had before. And the other thing is I had this image in my mind from Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem that he talks about. It's about grieving, and it's about the sort of the power of like depression after something very large, right? The largesse of like the gravity of grief. And he uses this imagery about like cliffs and the fall off cliffs. And those cliffs made their way sort of to the end of my poem in there. So I sort of had this image that I wanted to capture. I don't think anyone would know that's like a reference to Gerard Manley Hopkins by reading it, but like those are his cliffs in my head, and I like wanted to get to that position. So the beginnings are like all these different pieces. It's form, it's what you're thinking about, it's a line, it's the vocabulary you give yourself in that like first line or that idea. Yeah, and that's kind of where it started for me. What about yours?
Yeah, I love this idea of what you were saying of having a pool of language and how there were actually like many beginnings and all the pieces of the beginning I really love. And also what you were saying about tiptoeing into a poem. I thought that was really, really interesting. I think for me, mine is two short fiction pieces. One is called Strip Mall Triptych, which is like more of a flash piece. And then the other one is called Kite Fighting, which is more, I would say like a micro piece. And I think what's really interesting is I'm really drawn to very short fiction forms, because I often find that the way we tell oral stories and like the source of people's anecdotes of just telling you these fascinating or weighty things in life they always come in like an expository short form. And I really love that. Kind of the shorter the form, the more you're allowed to just be expository and just tell the story. So I love stories that have no scenes in them. And both of the stories have no scenes in them. They're both just like paragraphs of exposition. And I'm a big lover of telling as a mode of storytelling. I know everyone is always like, show, don't tell, scenes, have scenes, but I love having no scenes. Because I find that like when someone is telling you a story, for example, the story that inspired the second one is about, there was this person flying a kite. Like it's always through exposition. And I just really love that part of oral storytelling. So I think the nature of spoken story inspired both of those. And then for the first one, Strip Mall Triptych, it actually started from the title and a curiosity about the title, because I really like using this word triptych, which to me is like super literary and a very literary term, very artistic, and pairing it with something that we don't usually consider to be like a source of literature, like a strip mall. And because I, grew up in strip malls, around strip malls, working in strip malls, I really wanted like a poetics of strip malls and like a literary category of strip malls, because I find them to be such like generative and often strange places. And so it was kind of a love letter to the strip mall. And I think the sound of things also really attract me. So just the sound of Strip Mall Triptych, it has like a rhyme to it, like the strip mall and then triptych both being like two syllables, and then strip and trip. I don't know, the sonics of it, I was like, I just want to use this title because it sounds interesting. And I often find that when I have like a micro piece, which is the second story, with flash, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm going to write a flash story, and it's a flash story. But with micros, I can never just be like, I'm going to write a micro story that's like 200 words and it's going to be a micro. It always is. I have like a 7,000 word story or like a 700 word story, and I end up taking like 2 sentences out of it. And I realize this is the only interesting part of this 7,000 word story is this one paragraph. And I'll just like take it out of a bigger thing and then kind of recraft it into a micro. But I can never just sit down and be like, here's a micro story. It always has to be pulled out of something really big. And I always have to have a revelation that like 6,000 of the words are not gonna end up in the story.
Do you keep the original, like, will you have both pieces, or is it like, no, I'm done with these 6,000 words, I'm keeping these 10?
It's usually I'm done. Yeah, wow. It's usually not like, because what happens is I'll usually realize that that's like the only interesting and alive part of the story is that one paragraph, and I just have to accept it. And usually it doesn't come across as scary or sad for me. It actually feels like relief to me, because I'll notice that these words are just like a slog for me to write and are not pleasurable for me to write and not alive. And so I'll feel this deep sense of relief that I get to just like take out or extract this thing that's still alive about it and use that, and not have to like go back into the painful slog of the other words. That's
incredible. I really wish I could do that. I don't think I could in that same way. Like that's a type of revision that takes like immense bravery that I do not have. I think there's another question. Oh, okay, that makes sense. We can go into that revision process. Do you write endless drafts? Do you edit as you go? Something in between? Post-its, Word docs, etc. Since you're talking about your revision, do you want to go first?
Oh yeah, sure. Revision is like the hardest thing for me. I love drafting and I hate revising, but revision is so important. So I always have a tendency to just want to start something new instead of looking at anything that I've already written. I feel like I don't necessarily edit as I go, which is why I find drafting really pleasurable, because I'm kind of just like, again, in that tunnel vision. And then in terms of the revision itself, I'll usually play around a lot with the level of language before realizing that I need to do something more significant or major than like playing around with a single word. But I often find that the language will guide me through that process, just like I feel like language leads me through drafting. I feel like even small things like the way words and sentences sound will still kind of guide me to what I find most interesting in the draft and what I want to rework and what maybe will belong somewhere else. And then interested in the difference here between fiction and poetry revising, I definitely think for me, this might also just be the expectations of poetry and fiction. I think people really allow the mystery in poems. Again, this is a very broad generalization, so I don't know if it's true. But I felt like oftentimes with poetry, my revision process was really different. And I think a lot of times we're told in fiction to revise toward clarity in a way that maybe with poetry, we allow the mystery or we allow the ambiguity to exist. And so I always have to try to find a balance between wanting to like revise toward clarity and all those things, but also to like preserve a sense of mystery or the inexplicable in a draft as well.
That's something that I wanted to ask you, like when I found out we were going to do this, because your work, I've read half of Bestiary. I haven't finished it yet, so please don't spoil it. But your work does this thing where like it doesn't rely on sort of what you were saying. It doesn't rely on the reality or the believability of, these are all the wrong words. It doesn't rely on the mathematics of like logic in a way. And I wondered how much of that was like an automatic impulse or how much of it you like pushed yourself to. Like, do you ever read this is like maybe a terrible question to ask, but do you ever read a page and you're like, no, this is too normal, or like this is too grounded, like I need to like up it a little bit?
Oh, I love that question. I actually have a tendency to be the opposite all the time, and I think it's because I really like how things sound, and I really like how the language sounds or looks on the page. And I often have to think later, like, what does it actually mean? So a huge part of the editorial process of Bestiary was actually just my editor highlighting sentences and being like, sounds great, but what does it mean? And then it would just be me in the margins being like, I don't know what it means. It means nothing. I just like how it sounds. Like I remember one sentence that I don't know if I ended up keeping it or changing it, but it was something about like, oh, being sainted by his sweat. And my editor was like, oh, it sounds really interesting. I want to know what it means. I want to see it. And I'm like, oh, I actually don't know anything about what it means. I just thought like the words like sweat and saint sound really interesting or look really interesting next to each other in contrast. So I think for me, it's always the opposite. I have to kind of, I don't want to say rein myself back, but I have to, in the revision process, ask myself, like, what is the actual meaning here? And
Right.
When is the language pulling me away and leading me astray? And when is the language like also interesting on multiple levels and not purely just like, oh, these words start with an S. But I'm really curious for you too, as someone who is also like multi-genre writing, whether you consider the revision and drafting processes to be different and whether you kind of go in with an intuitive feel for that difference, or yeah, whether you approach things really similarly, because I find I often get that question. I'm not sure how to answer it. And I'm just really curious about yours. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is like, I don't write good fiction. So like, I just I don't have fiction skills. I like write a little bit of it. I'm not comfortable in it. Revision for me in fiction, which I discovered during my MFA program, was very like, listen to what my professor said. Like, I just was like, okay, that's how it should work. I do not think in narrative. It's just, you know, which is also why reading Bestiary has been such a joy, because you don't rely on it in the same way that you clearly rely on language, which is like lovely for me as a poet. So I don't know in terms of fiction. I just can't answer that question. In terms of poetry, to be honest, I really wish I went into my MFA thinking that I was going to become a better reviser. And I did not. I have a very like hard relationship with revision for poetry. I revise as I go, and maybe that's kind of in the question, the phrasing. Every line I write, I rewrite it 40 times before I'm happy with a line, right? And so because of that, every line that comes after is sitting on the scaffolding to me of the lines before it. And as soon as you start revising in the same sort of traditional sense of like line editing or whatever that you would for fiction, it's, you know, a crude metaphor, but it's that Jenga tower, and you like pull one out and it just collapses. And so I have a very, very difficult time with that. That said, I basically go into a poem in like 2 modes, and they're kind of similar to how you were talking before. One, I'm writing a poem, and I'm writing a poem to like write a good poem, and the poem that is saying what I'm going to say. Or I have a vague idea of what I want to talk about. Maybe let's like write a draft of something. To me, that's not writing poetry. That's like writing a draft in your like drafts folder. And then I'll use that somewhere else when I'm writing a poem. Those pieces of draft, like what I end up doing is completely rewriting. So I look at it and I say, I'll send it to a friend, or I'll like look at it myself and say, what about this is working? Because most of it's not. I see the thing that's working, and then I'll rewrite the poem from that angle. But I can't hand somebody a poem that I think is done and be like, what should I fix? Because I'm like, it's done. Like I wrote it, it's done, it's over. I think that's the simple answer. It's very difficult for me to move on from a line unless it's done. So.
Wow, actually, you brought up something that I've never really thought about in this way before, but I guess that I also always wanted to like articulate, but like the emotional aspect of revising, and like how sometimes it's done because you're done with it. And I feel like no one ever talks about that. I feel like we always talk about revision as like this endless process. And I really admire people who always see their work as a work in progress. But for me, I feel the same way, where I'm like, sometimes it's done because I just can't anymore. Sometimes it's done because I've emotionally moved on from it, and I can no longer return to the moment of that piece. And that's why it's done. Like there's no science or no like marker of quality that can be like neatly affixed to it to make it done. It's just like, I'm done. I really like the humanness of that, because I think, yeah, I'm very scared of revision process, because to me it seems really endless. And I feel like what you've said kind of reminds me that it's like, it is also, you know, a process that is just our living as well, and existing and writing. But also I was really interested in something that you were saying. Well, actually 2 things. The first was I was really interested in what you were saying of the idea of not being comfortable in fiction, because I definitely feel the same way as you. And I find that because I'm not comfortable in it, and because I still feel like I'm a beginner and like don't do it right, that I feel somehow more liberated in that process as well. And I think that what draws me to writing prose is this feeling of like, because I don't know it, I can't do it wrong for myself in the drafting phase. Obviously the editorial brain will say other things. But I'll feel like, well, it's okay if I have no dialogue because I'm not a fiction writer, or it's okay if I have no plot, I'm not a fiction writer. And that actually liberates me to write fiction, which is kind of like a weird reverse logic. And then I also love what you were saying about a crude metaphor and not being necessarily led by a narrative. And I was just wondering, yeah, what besides narrative feels really integral to your writing and what you follow? Do you think of it as like accrual of language, or yeah, it's just really interested.
Man, I don't know how to answer that. I guess well, there's two things here. One, that I read every line out loud when I write. I didn't know people didn't read stuff out loud when they were writing. And I think like that's wild, because I need to know what it sounds like. If it doesn't fit in my mouth, it like doesn't belong on the page. So I think that's really important. The other thing for me is if I'm writing about something that like I said sort of earlier, that I already understand, I need to come to another conclusion, because there's no point for me to like, I don't know, wax poetic about something that like I get. I don't know. So part of it is not explaining, but bringing a reader through a process of me trying to figure something out, or maybe like if I'm good enough, presenting something to them that they hadn't thought of either. So it's either like, you know, my narrator is like amazed by this thing. Maybe it's entertaining that they're amazed by this thing, or maybe the reader is also amazed by this thing and they didn't know it until they read the poem. So, you know, sound and a thread of interrogation, those are both things that I think are really important. I think there's a lot of focus in workshops that I've had in the past about like, tension's not the right word, but yeah, like conflict, like what's the conflict of the poem? And I'm not so focused on that, as long as I'm in conflict, my narrator's in conflict. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that so much. I love what you were saying about amazement, and I love the idea of like writing toward amazement as well. And I also agree about conflict, because I find that I actually read majority translated fiction or translated poetry. This wasn't true until I started writing fiction, actually, which is really interesting. I would read works in translation, but it'd always be like the exception, you know, like the few books a year that I read. And now I almost exclusively read books in translation. And I find the reason why is because I'm really interested in other fiction traditions. And the ways that conflict doesn't necessarily drive the narrative. And I find that I'm always just like, my mind is always blown when I read in other structures and read other ways of constructing sentences and other ways of constructing a narrative or a work. Like sometimes it's not even narrative. And I just find myself really inspired by that, and really drawing from that as well, and gaining a feeling of like affirmation that it's okay to not write necessarily from like conflict or linear narrative, by being given permission, I think, by reading works in translation. Oh, but yeah, there's another question I would love to ask. Oh, this is perfect. What writers have influenced you? Wow, we're just, you know, perfectly segueing into things, have influenced you in your writing. And do you find inspiration across genres? And are you in conversation with? Yeah, tied to what I was saying before, I think right now a lot of writers in translation I feel very in conversation with, or I'm really interested in. Like the fiction of Qiu Miaojing, who wrote Notes of a Crocodile and Letters from Montmartre. I'm not sure how to pronounce the French word, actually, so you can ignore that. The last one I just said. And writers like Bei Sua, and I just read this novella called The Hole, and I don't remember the name of the author, but I'll try to put it in the chat later. Yeah, and I find I really love the permission they give to just be very emotionally direct and honest. Because I find often we're told like, don't tell the reader what this person is feeling. Like, but Qiu Miaojing is just so emotionally direct. She's just like, I hate this person. I hate myself. I want to destroy this. And I'm just like, yes, I want to know all those things. Like, I want the emotional directness, and also very like not about grounding the reader. sometimes you don't even know who the narrator is. And you don't know if this other narrator is the narrator. And I love that blurring and that feeling of disorientation, because I think that we're typically taught to write to ground the reader. And I really am interested in, oh, what does it mean to want to write to disorient the reader, or to convey a sense of disorientation or ungroundedness. And I find, oh yay, the whole, okay, I'm so happy that I, even with my vague details, I'm able to, connect with someone about it. And so I find, again, that I'm very liberated by those writers. And definitely also writing in conversation with poets as well, and filmmakers too. But I'm really curious about you as well, and who inspires you.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say from what you said though, I feel like every time I read a piece that especially fiction, where it blows my mind about form, whether it's like not the traditional like Western narrative, whatever, I'm mad, because I'm like, everyone lied to me that this is like what it has to be. That happens all the time, where I'm just like, I'm so angry that the novels, the teachers I've had or whatever have told me like this is how to do it, because clearly there's like a million different ways to do it. Yes, so people who inspire me or that I'm in conversation with, in conversation with question is like so hard for me, because every time I like somebody asks it, I'm like, but who would like, they're not talking to me, like I don't deserve to talk to them. This isn't a conversation, this is just like an imitation. Which is, but I more often return to single poems than I do single authors. There are poems that just like live in my, heart, that I like repeat over and over to myself. But I would say the writers I've returned to the most often are Terrence Hayes, Kay Ryan. I love Kay Ryan, and Lee Young Lee. I'm currently reading The Undressing for the first time. I've read the rest of his collections, and I love them so much. I return to them a lot. Terrence, I mean, the thing about the three people that I listed is they like have proven to me as a writer that there are perfect poems, which is like, people will lie and be like, no, you can revise a poem forever. And I'm like, no, they're perfect poems, and like they've been finished. But anyway.
That's really interesting, because I do feel that way about a lot of poems too, about like there's a kind of perfection to the poems. And then I find that the fiction I love most are ones that are just are like really deliberately flawed, if that makes sense. Like there are big holes in it, or like the narrator will just like suddenly switch, and there are all these like inexplicable moments, and like moments that feel confusing. Like I find that that's like an interesting contrast for me when I'm like holding something close to my heart that's a poem versus a work of fiction. Oh, the next question. What role does the atmosphere or environment play in your writing practice? Is there a specific setting or environmental factors, or can you write anywhere? This is a really interesting question, because it's actually changed for me recently. Probably earlier when we were talking, you could hear my birds in the background. I have 3 birds, and they're very, very loud. And I used to always write better with ambient noise, with people's voices in the background, conversation, because I grew up in a very large and very noisy household. So to me, silence is like very aggressive. And I'm just like, oh my God, I'm so uncomfortable with this. Whereas like the sound of people having conversations, laughing, arguing, TV's on, like a lot of sound to me is very comfortable. So I used to be able to write with a lot of sound, and now, because actually interestingly, my birds, it turns out like I react to bird sounds differently than human sounds. And I find that it's really, really, really hard for me to think about anything else when the birds are chattering. So I now have these like gigantic earmuffs that are for woodworkers. So that's supposed to block out the sound of a power saw if you're woodworking. And I wear them, and they're gigantic. And I probably shouldn't wear them for too long, because otherwise I can't hear anything, and there could be like a fire going on, and everyone could be running and screaming, and I wouldn't know. And I've recently become so used to that extreme sound deprivation, like so sound deprived that I can't even hear myself type. And I can actually hear like the rushing of my own blood in my ears, that now I can't have no tolerance for any sound. So now I'm always wearing them. And I'm like, oh no, I've just become reliant on like total and absolute silence. And that's, I don't know, that seems very not achievable. But anyway, sorry, that's my random sound anecdote. But we'd love to hear, what environments you write in.
Oh, I love that so much. I also think it's very like, I think you can train yourself with sound stuff, and that might be part of it. You slept like a normal human for years, and then I went through a bout of insomnia, and I in like my early 20s, and I started listening to audiobooks to go to bed. And that's the only way I can sleep now. When there's silence, I just like cannot sleep. I'm like, you're all crazy. It's too quiet in here. But anyway, the environmental factors. The only thing I need is a laptop. I'm really bad. I have friends who write with like paper and pen. My revision process, like I said, I rewrite every line 40 times. It's just impossible with paper and pen. I would prefer nighttime. I would prefer a glass of whiskey. It's not necessary, but it's great. I think those are the only like musts for me. I'm also not great with sound, but like it hasn't been a huge issue because of COVID. We're like home, so I don't have birds. So sadly, we talked about this beforehand, by the way. We're both bird people, and so that was a very interesting and delightful discovery.
I know, we're a rare species. Also, I want to just say, coincidentally, speaking of like connections that are unexpected, I also, similar to you, was like sleeping super normally, and then had this wild bout of insomnia a couple of years ago. And since then, it's almost like I unlearned how to sleep. So now I'm like, oh, wait, I know that I don't have to sleep. So now I'm not going to, like, my body is like, oh, you're capable. And I'm like, no, go back to when you thought you had to sleep. But that's really interesting because I also encountered that as well. I was like, oh my God, wow, what a connection.
Yeah.
And then also another thing you were saying about having to have a laptop or not handwriting as much, I actually feel the same way. I actually can't handwrite. And I find it's because my brain works, I have very weird handwriting. I'm a righty who writes like a lefty, like really tilted to the left. And my grip is like really strange. I think because I like got traumatized as a child about holding my pen incorrectly. And then out of defiance, I was like, I'm going to continue holding it in my weird like fist-like grip. But I write very slowly and my brain is like going faster than my hand. And I think for some people, handwriting actually helps because when you slow down, it can actually lead you to more interesting thoughts, or it can actually, like, the slowing down is actually important to the process. But for me, if I don't capture it in the moment, it's gone forever. And then I have no way to retrieve it. So I actually really avoid handwriting because I know I'm going to lose like every other sentence that isn't in my brain.
100%. Yeah. Totally agree with that. I also like on the page, a lot of like basically the bric-a-brac of a poem that I don't use ends up at the bottom. So like I'll pull it and then it's like a collection of just like, garbage, like it's a midden at the bottom of your page and you're like, okay. And then sometimes you pull things back up, right? So I can't do that on paper, but yeah. Next question. In a similar vein, are there any rituals you have or ascribe to or have formulated for yourself? I don't really. I think I can defer to you on this one. I like writing at night. That's definitely a ritual for me.
I, similar to you, like writing at night, and I've tried to become a morning writer and to write before work and right before I do anything. But I find that I really like to feel alone when I'm writing, and at night you feel really alone, or I feel really alone at night, especially when it's so dark outside that you can't even see outside. You just like see the reflection of your own face in the window because it's so dark. And I feel like feeling alone in the world a little bit can sometimes help you focus in on the writing, or at least help me focus in on the writing. And I find that during the day and the morning, I'm thinking about like emails I have to answer and things I have to do. And some people can have that feeling in the morning where they feel like, oh, before I check my phone, before I go to work, before I do any of these things, I can be alone with my writing, but I cannot. I don't feel alone in the mornings. And in terms of rituals, I also don't have any rituals. I do enjoy writing in transit a lot. when I used to take the bus a lot, and I was also taking the subway a lot, which I don't now anymore, I found that I could kind of be lulled in my writing. And I also found that having like a really short amount of time was actually really, really helpful and interesting, because I didn't give myself pressure to be like, you need to write a draft on the subway. And obviously trying to stay also like alert, so I'm not just like on the train for 3 hours. And I find that that compressed amount of time was actually really interesting for me. Yeah. Oh yes, I also wrote about writing in transit as a thing. And like I often find if I'm in a car too, I have like the equivalent of shower thoughts, but in the car, like car thoughts, and those can be really interesting as well. Yeah.
Criticism, feedback. I think a simple answer is kind of what I was talking about before, for me, which is just that the work is private for me until it's done. If it's like a poem I'm working on, if it's just like a weird draft of something, I will hand it to a friend and be like, what's working? And then I'll go with that. Yeah, I like, it's kind of what you said earlier. It's like, yeah, you don't want somebody coming in and being like, what does this mean? You want to finish it and like figure out what it means for yourself, or at least I do. I need to like know a poem very well. I need to have read it a lot out loud. So if I do get feedback, I like know what the reason is behind the line. I kind of, yeah, this is stupid, but I kind of need to know the poem as a friend, and like I need to like understand it in its history before I can share it in any capacity other than, yeah, with anyone else. That feels very possessive. I'm like saying this out loud and I'm like, am I very possessive of my poems? Do I need to let go? I don't know. What about
I
you?
feel the exact same way as you. So
Okay.
if we're both possessive, this is just the theme. We're just the possessive ones. Also, it's really funny that you were saying of like letting go, because I remember my mom, especially when my novel was coming out, was like, she was always telling me like, detach. She's like, embrace the Buddhist wisdom of detaching and detaching from the work. And I was like, oh, I need to achieve that. But similar to you, I actually do my absolute best to have the fewest number of people look at it before it's published. And I think I'm really grateful for that reason to have an editor that I work with, because then I don't feel, I think I might feel obligated to ask for feedback just to make sure I'm not like totally alone in caring about something. But I find that now that I have a sort of like, not pipeline, but like a person who I have a relationship with, that I feel comfortable like not showing anyone but my editor. And yeah, I think it's a similar thing. Like it needs to be done first. I need to in some way close it off a little bit before because otherwise it's like too porous, and I just don't, I just can't, share it with anyone yet. Yeah.
If I've gotten to the point where like the poem is memorized in my head, that means I have enough distance that like I can talk about it. But I need to know it really, really well. It's like I have like a background in theater, so pardon the like metaphor, but it's like it's like being off book. Like you can't do any acting until you know the lines very well. Yeah, no, I'm glad we're on the same page. I feel like there's like a guilt to like not being able to let somebody like have access to your work early. Like, why don't you, like, I think one of the most embarrassing things about my like writing process is that I like am bad with revision, and like I'm that I'm more protective, but I feel like I need to talk to more writers and like learn that we all do that and be like, okay, it's fine.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think there is a lot of pressure to like workshop, and this idea that you want as many random people to see it as possible. Like I was always told that workshop is useful because people who wouldn't otherwise see your work will be seeing your work. People who would never pick your book off of a shelf will be reading your work. And I'm like, that seems really antithetical because then how do we know how to guide our own work if we don't follow our own instincts and we instead defer to people who would never be interested in it in the first place. I just felt like the logic was weird. I'm not saying that all workshop is bad or anything like that. I'm just saying like that logic was always a little strange to me. And I was like, oh, we always need to be our own compasses first and foremost if we can. And I feel like I have kind of an interesting thing about like also the going off book. I feel like my equivalent of being done with something is that I forget it completely and I've moved on to something else. I know that I'm ready and that that thing is done. I don't want to be like, it's dead to me now, but like kind of, which sounds really scary and violent. I don't mean it in that way, but I mean that it's something else is more alive to me and something else is drawing me toward it. And I've kind of not forgotten, but the other thing I'm okay leaving it behind. And that's when I know that I'm done with it, is when I'm like, oh, what? When was that? What was that about? Yeah.
Totally. Do we work on multiple pieces at the same time or focus solely on one particular piece? I basically work on one thing at a time unless it's like just very much not working.
Yeah, I think for me, it varies. I tend to be working on one thing and revising one thing at the same time, but never like on the same day or anything like that. Like it's never like I'm switching back and forth between documents rapidly or something like that. But in the back of my mind, I'll have one story that have distance from and that I'm revising. And then in the foreground, I'll have something that I'm either planning to write or drafting. So I do tend to have multiple things, but when I have like single days of writing or weeks, I will focus on one thing at a time. Because I think it is really hard to just switch back and forth between things. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, that concludes the questions that we had for you. K-Ming and Dani, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I have so many notes written down. I always take notes during these things. I have books to look up and absolutely pieces that I want to cut down into microfiction now. So I'm going to go do that after this. But this was so like lovely and real. And just thank you guys for being like so honest about your process. Let's see. Thank you to Rachel and Susan and the HFR staff for making this happen, and to all of y'all, for everyone who came to this coffee chat. So thank you again, K-Ming, Dani, and everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. I feel very comforted and not as alone. So I'm really happy that we had this conversation. Thanks.